welcome to today's episode of the Old Board Podcast. We talk about directed service orders and how the Rock Island did a reverse 360 from being operated Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard Podcast, your twice-weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B, PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who's slowly becoming a highly trained broadcast specialist. And I am blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never ceases. And after plenty of time on the road, I am blessed to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. So today, we are talking about directed service orders, and you're probably wondering, Phil, this sounds like kind of a boring topic. Why are we talking about directed service orders? Well, because they're actually not very boring, they're very interesting, and because it is a device that allows the Surface Transportation Board to take steps to maintain service in situations where a railroad cannot do so. And this is important because I want you to remember something. The most important aspect of railroading is the ability of the railroad to provide service to its customers. Might sound basic, but it's a concept that always gets lost. And the Surface Transportation Board, being the economic regulator of the railroad industry, also positions itself as a guarantor of the services being provided. And this is an extension of what the Interstate Commerce Commission, that was the Surface Transportation Board's predecessor, also did during its time in charge or overseeing the economic aspect of railroading. And this has gotten in the news because of the Blackwell Northern Gateway Railroad, which is operating, or I should say was operating, in the states of Kansas and Oklahoma. And you might remember in January, the Federal Railroad Administration, which oversees railroad safety, shut the carrier down completely for what they call gross violations of rail safety rules. Well, that left some of the railroad's customers in the lurch, and therefore a directed service order has been issued to Rock Island Rail, which is a newer carrier owned by a man named Robert Riley and his wife Gwen, that's operated a variety of short lines and been growing in recent years, actually very spectacular growth, in fact, to be the designated operator of the Blackwell Northern Gateway Railroad in those areas. And what's more, the Blackwell Northern is not the owner of the track. There are a couple of authorities, state of Oklahoma and also Blackwell Industrial Authority, which is an economic development entity in the state of Kansas, that actually own the track and lease it out for operation. So I wanted to get into several examples of directed service orders, why they exist, and so on. Now, it has an initial time limit of between 30 and 240 days. So now the Surface Transportation Board and previously the Interstate Commerce Commission could say that this railroad is unable to meet its obligations, so we're going to find another railroad to do it. So minimum 30 days and up to 240 days. Now, the interesting thing about this is it's not just a situation like the Blackwell Northern. It could be a situation where, let's say, there was a washout on a particular line, and so now the railroad that normally bases its operations out of point A and operates to point B, then through the washout area to point C, can no longer reach point C. So a railroad that connects at the other end could be the directed operator of that segment until the carrier is able to restore the line and operate the full length. You can also have a situation like the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific that we'll get into in a little bit, where the Rock Island was under strike. It also had no money, and therefore it wasn't able to provide service. And so another carrier, in this case Kansas City Terminal, was appointed to be the directed service operator. Now, another example, which is not quite the same as a directed service order, but I think is worth mentioning, comes to us in the Northeast. And that's when the Jersey Central and the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western took over portions of the Lehigh and New England. And since we are a railroad podcast, I think it'd be a lot of fun if we actually saw a little bit of what this was like. The Lehigh and New England, of course, being a railroad that operated in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and into the state of New York. And it was at the end owned by the Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company. And here is a photo of the Lehigh in New England. You see some of its Alco FAs, if you're watching us on CP5 Cam, crossing the Lehigh Gap. And so that's an example of the Lehigh in New England. The Lehigh in New England shut down in 1961, but it did not shut down because of financial trouble. It actually shut down because its ownership said, look, we don't actually see much of a future in anthracite coal, which was its primary commodity. Secondary commodity was cement. And therefore, we're going to stop doing this, and hence the railroad then shut down. As a result, you had the Interstate Commerce Commission work with some railroads in the region, and this being the Erie-Lackawanna and also the Jersey Central, to take over portions of that. I know I said the DL&W earlier, but by that point it was Erie-Lackawanna, to take over portions of that were viable and still had customers to operate it. So while that was not strictly a directed service order in the 30 to 240 day sense, in a broader sense, it really was. Another that I would like to point out comes from the Jersey Central itself. And we've got a little photo here, one of my favorite railroads, of course, the Erie-Lackawanna that we were talking about a moment ago. And here you see an Erie-Lackawanna SD45 leading a couple Jersey Central, originally Baltimore and Ohio SD40s on it's Paradise, Pennsylvania area, or one of the many Paradise, Pennsylvania's areas named Paradise in Pennsylvania, but that's on the Erie-Lackawanna. That was as part of the Jersey Central's retreat from Pennsylvania, which happened in 1972. The Jersey Central, like a variety of other carriers, was struggling quite a bit, financially in trouble, and therefore they figured that getting out of Pennsylvania and cutting some of their losses would help it become more viable. Jersey Central had been, by that point, bankrupt for 11 years. This ended up not happening, and it was, of course, swept into Conrail along with the Erie-Lackawanna, but they took two steps. The first was to work with the Erie-Lackawanna to move traffic over its lines into Pennsylvania, where it would reach some of the customers. The other step was for some of its trackage, including Allentown Yard, to become part of the Lehigh Valley, which in many places parallel the Jersey Central. And that's how you've seen much of what's happened today, where many of those lines were where they were Jersey Central, otherwise tied into former LV track. And this is what created what is now a consolidated system in that area, now partially owned by Norfolk Southern, and in other places owned by the Reading, Blue Mountain, and Northern. So you saw a lot of that creation, in fact, coming about thanks to something that was brokered by the Interstate Commerce Commission using railroads in the region. So again, while those were not directed service, they're very similar to that, and that ends up fitting the ultimate goal of the directed service order, which is to ensure service being provided to customers. Now, wanted to point out that the rules, emergency service rules, were recently revised by the Surface Transportation Board. And so I'm going to do something that's a little boring. I'm going to read this, but I want to make sure you understand it. It says, under 49 U.S.C. United States Code 11123, the board may issue an emergency service order when it determines that there exists an emergency situation of such magnitude as to have substantial adverse effects on shippers or on rail service in a region of the United States, or that a rail carrier cannot support traffic offered to it in a manner that properly serves the public. And they go on from there. So that's a little idea of the enabling legislation, and what we have linked in the description is that final rule that was discussed there. So now let's move on to a couple of other examples of actual directed service before we get to the fun of the Blackwell Gateway Northern. Now, in 1979, the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad, the Rock Island Line, a mighty fine line. Well, it wasn't mighty fine. It was struck by one of the more militant rail unions, the Brotherhood of Railroad and Airline Clerks, better known as BRAC. But by 1979, the Rock Island had long been out of money because in 1964, when it was still a viable carrier, it had reached an agreement with the Union Pacific for the Union Pacific to take it over. The Interstate Commerce Commission, which preceded the Surface Transportation Board as the railroad's economic regulator, dragged its feet in a way that is absolutely unconscionable, and I don't think has ever been seen in any form of regulatory structure any industry anywhere in the United States. It took 10 years for the Interstate Commerce Commission to decide, and then on a split decision, by the way, well, not unanimous, a split decision, that the Union Pacific could then take over the Rock Island. Well, unfortunately, by the time the Interstate Commerce Commission decided that this was a good idea, which most people had understood a long time ago, the Rock Island was in trouble, went bankrupt, and that's all she wrote. Here is a map of the Rock Island, and it's loading because it's quite a big map. It shows it serving 14 states in the Midwest and the West. That gives you an idea. Now, to be clear, the black line that goes into the north, into North Dakota and so on, that was actually added by whomever actually owns the map, and I do believe that's Randall O'Toole, since this is on his streamlinermemories.info site. But you can see the Rock Island, Minnesota, Illinois, even down into Texas, Louisiana, and so on. That was a very substantial railroad. And anecdotally, even as they were going into bankruptcy, it was not a line that was bereft of traffic by any means. So this created what was truly a transportation emergency because, as is quoted in the Washington Post, the 7,000 miles and 7,200 mile railroad by that point was carrying 10% of Midwestern grain, and that included 1,650 grain elevators. And that's important to remember because a lot of the Granger railroads, that's what we call them, and we're talking about here the Rock Island, the Milwaukee Road, Chicago and Northwestern, Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, Missouri Pacific, and so on. They had a very difficult time with grain. And the reason why is while grain can be a very, very strong source of traffic, remember, you've got to grow it. So there's a lot of time when it's not moving. Then it's got to be harvested. Then it has to be moved in a crush because it has to be moved to elevators where it's going to be then taken for processing or to facilities where you're going to make it into things like bread and so on. But that means that the traffic is there's not much of it for a good portion of the year. Then there's a lot of it. So you have to be able to scale up in terms of your car supply, your locomotive supply, and of course your crews to be able to handle the crush. So that's why even today, Canadian National and Canadian Pacific are constantly at war with grain shippers in Canada and also the Canadian government over the carriage of grain. It's just hard to do, even though it can make your railroad very wealthy. But that also means, as I said, in those times when it's not moving, you do have an enormous fixed asset cost that is associated with keeping a lot of the asset base, whether it's cars, because cars are not always going to be available. Can you lease them? Can you lease them on favorable terms? Are you able to find them when you need them, and so on? And crews, and of course, just like any other job, a crew member isn't going to say, okay, well, I'm happy to work with you between these dates, and then I'll just go find some other work. Some people do that, but most want to be continuously employed. So that's also why it's difficult to control the cost and be able to scale up and down as needed. So this is one of the reasons why the Rock Island, despite being a very successful 14-state railroad, was not always the most financially viable carrier. So what happens in 1979? September 26, the Interstate Commerce Commission issues an order for the Kansas City Terminal, which is exactly that, a terminal railroad, a small railroad in Kansas City that operated Kansas City Union Station and some other lines in the area, and still does operate those lines under the aegis of Watco. But at the time, then as now, was owned by the majority of Class 1 carriers that serve the area to then begin operating it. Now, the directed service orders, such as that which the KCT was operating under, provided for a 5% profit, so a guaranteed profit built in, plus the costs that were expended in providing the service. So that goes to everything from labor to locomotive maintenance and otherwise. Unfortunately, that directed service ended on March 23rd, 1980, when the Rock Island was formally abandoned. And after that, we know that the majority of the railroad was sold off. Some of it was torn up. Some of it has seen a resurgence under Henry Posner III's Iowa Interstate, which is operating the Chicago to Council Bluffs portion, along with some associated trackage. And so the Rock Island is now no longer with us, at least not that original Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific. So keep that in mind, though, because shortly that will come back to us toward the end of the show. The next is coming to us from the Delaware and Hudson. And we know the Delaware and Hudson is one of the most famous railroads in American history, and that's because the D&H was, for a long time, the longest continuously operated transportation enterprise in U.S. history. The D&H had begun as a canal company, the Delaware and Hudson Canal. Later on, it got into railroads, and what it ended up being was this railroad that operated from Montreal down to the Scranton-Wilkes-Barre area via Albany and Binghamton, New York. But, on April 1st, 1976, though, the Delaware and Hudson expanded substantially with the acquisition of operating rights over Conrail. Now, remember, Conrail was created out of the assets of a variety of bankrupt railroads such as Penn Central, Reading, Erie-Lackawanna, Jersey Central, Lehigh Valley, and so on. But this left the people, the United States Railway Association, the second USRA, with a problem. And the problem was you went from having an area where a lot of railroads were competing with each other and also competing with highway transportation to now nobody competing with each other except for a few small lines that were operating areas that Conrail didn't want or for whatever reason was not able to get control of. An example of that being the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, another example of that being the Providence and Worcester. So there was the belief then as now that you had to have competition. So the Delaware and Hudson was given operating rights going to areas such as Sunbury, Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C., northern New Jersey, and also Philadelphia. So this way it was able to solicit traffic and operate over Conrail and then get that traffic onto its main line, Scranton-Wilkes-Barre area, also Binghamton, New York, and go up to Montreal, Rouse's Point, New York, Montreal, Quebec. Now, why would you want to go to Rouse's Point in Montreal? Well, Montreal is now a major port because that's the beginning of the St. Lawrence Seaway, but it is a port on the Atlantic Ocean. Also, they had operating rights that took it to Buffalo, and that would become very important later as the 1980s and the 1990s wore on. The problem, as Brooks Bentz mentions in some of the interviews that he's done for the Railroaders Hall of Fame, is that this did not actually generate very much in the way of actual traffic for the D&H. So therefore, while they were very scrappy and they had a great CEO in Bruce Sturzing, Carl B. Bruce Sturzing, and he is best known as being the man who purchased the Baldwin RF-16 Sharks and bought them to the D&H, and also the Alco PAs and bought them there. It just didn't generate much in the way of traffic. Now, again, since this is a railroad podcast, we would be remiss if we didn't show you some actual trains. And so of that era, you have a former Erie-Lackawanna SD-45 to your right, number 803, and that engine is very interesting because it is one of the three EMD demonstrators the Delaware and Hudson purchased, which was notable at the time, and this was in the Derrico era. Notable because the Delaware and Hudson was almost entirely an Alco and General Electric railroad, and so getting into EMDs was a little bit different for them, but they did purchase that. But at the time, the D&H was owned by Derrico, which is a subsidiary of the Norfolk and Western, and same goes with the Erie-Lackawanna. Then the D&H looked over and said, well, we don't really want these EMDs, so they swapped them to the Erie-Lackawanna for the like number. I think it was 3 U33Cs. So the Erie-Lackawanna sent its U33Cs, some of them to the D&H. The D&H, the EL got these SD45s, and that's why you see the 803 wearing Erie-Lackawanna paint. But also you all notice that the Erie-Lackawanna diamond has been painted out, and it has the Delaware and Hudson logo. That's because this is post-Conrail. Conrail had taken over, and as a result, the D&H was independent, took that engine back. Also noteworthy there, if you look very closely, you see it has an L-shaped windshield on the engineer's side, and that was one of the innovations that EMD attempted in the 1970s. It's very rare now, didn't go very far, and likely because that is a large piece of glazing that's very expensive, whether we're talking about actual glass or a material like Lexan that is less breakable to replace. So that's why those never really came into vogue. But just wanted to make sure that those of you who are fellow rail enthusiasts have a chance to see some trains and not just my handsome face talking to you about them. But the D&H wasn't making much money doing this. In fact, it ended up on death's door, and as a result, it was sold to Guilford Transportation Industries, owned by Timothy Mellon. Timothy Mellon had taken over first the Boston and Maine and then the Maine Central, and what he had done is put both of the operations of those carriers, as we discussed in a previous episode, under the Springfield Terminal, which is a subsidiary of the Boston and Maine that only required two-man crews to operate trains. This helped dramatically lower the labor cost on the Boston and Maine and the Maine Central. Mellon wanted to do the same thing with the Delaware and Hudson, but the Delaware and Hudson's unions went absolutely bonkers when he tried this, and even to the point of destroying property and otherwise, and so therefore Mellon put the railroad into bankruptcy. Now, before that happened, Guilford had, and let me make sure I get this right, one of the more interesting things they did is the Boston and Maine sold fuel, which was, by the way, Boston and Maine, a subsidiary of Guilford and therefore a sister company of the Delaware and Hudson at the time, sold fuel to the D&H. And since the D&H, on paper, owed money to its sister company for this fuel, Guilford decided to remedy that by taking the GP39-2s, many of which had been acquired by the D&H as a result of, from the Reading, or the estate of the Reading, and were actually owned by CSX, just to make this more convoluted. They had taken those as well as some others and added them to the Boston and Maine roster. Those engines had cab signals which were needed to operate on the Northeast Corridor, where the Delaware and Hudson had its operating rights. So when the Delaware and Hudson is placed in bankruptcy, suddenly it's not able to exercise these operating rights because it doesn't have locomotives able to operate down the routes that required cab signals. So this is one of the things that really plagued the D&H among others when it went bankrupt, and at the time was said to have more than $100 million in debt. Now, I want to be clear, I am not, as many of you are, haters of Tim Mellon. I actually think that Tim Mellon did something that many people would not have attempted to do, given the railroad picture of the Northeast in the 1970s and then the early 1980s. So I don't look at it in the same negative way as a lot of folks do. But I will point out that he was reviled for how the D&H and also the other railroads that were part of Guilford, later Pan Am, ended up turning out. And so now you have a bankrupt Delaware and Hudson that needs to be operated. And therefore, this is when the New York, Susquehanna, and Western, these guys stepped in to be the designated operator. Now, this was not simply the Interstate Commerce Commission saying, well, there's a scrappy little short line over there. Let's see if we can, let's see what they're able to accomplish. The reality is the New York, Susquehanna, and Western was supported by both CSX and Norfolk Southern in this effort, and they were supported, and here's a good example of that support. That is one of the higher numbered NYS&W B40-8s that were actually paid for by CSX and were owned by CSX and were ended up being taken back by them after the designated service period ended. But they supported the effort because this gave them access to the Northeastern rail market, very robust access to the Northeastern rail market that Conrail was dominating. And this is when you saw the beginnings of what the NYS&W would be so successful at doing in the 1980s and the 1990s, which was the operation of double stack trains and being able to compete directly with Conrail. So they were hoping that by serving as a designated operator, the NYS&W would end up becoming the owner of the D&H as it was in bankruptcy court, and the court was trying to figure out who they would sell it to. Now, at the end of the day, most of the anecdotes I've seen indicate that the court didn't really look at the NYS&W, which, by the way, was a very successful company by that point, under the leadership of Walter Rich. It had expanded from being a left for dead branch in New Jersey to being a very strong operator that extended between the New York City area in Edgewater and Croxton Yard, all the way up to Syracuse and Utica, New York. But the Delaware and Hudson was a pretty substantial property, and so the judges did not believe that the judge did not believe that they would be capable of doing that. And when I put this here, sorry we don't have a a better picture of that, just so you can see what the route map looked like. So this was from their 1989 Delaware Otsego annual report, and the Delaware Otsego was the owner of the New York Susquehanna and Western, being Walter Rich's company. And at this point, it was, of course, publicly traded. In fact, just as an aside, when I was a kid, my aunt got me a share of Delaware Otsego stock, and I did not want to tender my share when the Delaware Otsego was taken over by CSX and Norfolk Southern, because I wanted some way to preserve it. Interestingly enough, I could not do that because the stock ended up being canceled. And even to this day, as now a 43-year-old, there is a small amount of money in a suspense account being held for me when I finally do tender my now worthless share of the Delaware Otsego to the transfer agent. But some fun things happened. The NYS&W did become a real rock star during that period. And one of the most noteworthy things that took place is that Amtrak, even Amtrak, recognized the NYS&W as the operator of the Delaware and Hudson, and that includes this. And you see, this is the schedule for the Adirondack, which operated over the D&H and still does, by the way. D&H between Schenectady and Rouse's Point, New York. And there you can see, if you look on the entry for Rouse's Point, NYS&W, because at the time in 1989, the NYS&W was operating the Delaware and Hudson. And so, therefore, they did get some recognition that you would not expect a lot of short line carriers to receive. And now, finally, to the main event. You probably heard a lot about it, so here it is. The Blackwell Northern. The Blackwell Northern, very interesting railroad. So 35.3 route miles, and these are over lines owned by the Oklahoma DOT and the Blackwell Industrial Authority. The interchanges with the BNSF. Now, customers include Tensar Corporation, which receives aggregates, and also TDS, which is a decommissioner of transformers. Now, the carrier was sold during the fourth quarter of 2023 to a man named Noah McCann, who was apparently a very substantial rail enthusiast, and an unknown partner who, according to at least one source, resides in the state of California, but nobody is exactly sure who that is. Now, there have been allegations by the Federal Railroad Administration of poor record keeping, if any record keeping took place at all, and document forgeries, including supposedly McCann's own engineer license being a forgery. There is even the lurid story that allegedly McCann was apparently trying to get close to a young lady that's a little too young and claimed to have given her a diesel locomotive. So I know you're probably wondering, where did we get into Jerry Springer here? I don't know if this is true, but we've linked a video that was fairly well sourced in discussing the Blackwell Northern Gateway, and so I hope you'll watch it after you get done with this so you can see all that is there. The one thing I will tell you, men, if you do decide to become a railroad operator, please do not give your locomotives away to your prospective girlfriends. Just don't do it. It's a bad idea. Anyway, there were also allegations that non-qualified individuals were allowed to operate trains, and they also had unreported derailments. And so the FRA began investigating almost immediately after new ownership took over the carrier, and the result was not pretty. So in January, as we mentioned before, the carrier was told they may not operate anything on rails under any circumstances, and pretty hefty fines if they do violate that. So this saw them pull out. And we also have linked in the description the orders by the request by the ownership of the track, again, Blackwell Industrial Authority and Oklahoma DOT, to end the lease of the Blackwell Northern Gateway over their 35.3 miles of track. Appointed to do this, to operate this track as a designated operator, is Rock Island Rail. That's the interesting reverse 360 here, because earlier we were talking about how the Chicago Rock Island and Pacific, the original Rock Island, was the subject of directed service, and because it was no longer able to provide service, it's operated by the Kansas City Terminal. Now its successor, in many ways, at least in name, Rock Island Rail, which is owned by Robert and Gwen Riley, is now the designated operator or directed service operator of the Blackwell Northern Gateway. So it's very interesting how that name has undergone a change. We don't know how this is going to end. Now, we know that Rock Island Rail is a very credible operator. They have been growing, bootstrapping their business, and I've been lucky enough to follow Mr. Riley on Facebook, and I really do like a lot of what I see. You see so many examples, as we've talked about in the past, whether it's Iowa Pacific or Venango River, where the ownership does have a desire to provide good service, but they often get overextended or kind of get outside of what would be a reasonable business plan. But from all that I can see as an outsider, Rock Island Rail has stuck to its business plan and looked for bona fide opportunities that are accretive to the bottom line, allowing them to grow. And that is what's made them a great candidate for this 35.3 mile route. It is likely, or is possible, I should say, that they will become a permanent operator, but that, of course, is going to be up to the owners, the lessors of the line, if they'll allow them to do that, but they certainly have the ability to make a great case. So now you understand a little bit about directed service orders, where they come from, why they matter, and what the role that's happening today. So what I want you to do is follow us on All Things Trains, and I'm going to show you right here our Rail News and Insights page. This is where you can find a lot of great information about what is going on in the rail industry at any given time. And as you scroll down here, you see from our post a few days ago, or I should say a few weeks ago, you scroll down, we talk a little bit about the Blackwell Northern Gateway, a new path through Route Rock on February 27th. So this is a great example of what you'll be able to find when you visit allthingstrains.com, which I hope you will start your day by doing. Now, we will be back next Monday with a new topic. And what I want you to do in the meantime is like, share, subscribe, and also become a member over at allthingstrains.com. So we'll see you down the main line. Thanks for choosing All Things Trains, and I hope you have a great week.